Welcome back to the Global Take. We're going to be doing a deep dive today into the potential peace talks to end the Russia-Ukraine war.
Okay.
And we're going to be looking at this AP News article about Zelensky's visit to the UAE.
Sounds good.
Now, this is his first trip there since the war began.
Interesting.
But his wife has visited before.
Huh.
And so that's got me thinking, like, why is that?
Yeah, that is curious, isn't it? I mean, it makes you wonder if maybe she was there to, lay the groundwork for this visit.
Yeah.
Or if there were, some diplomatic objectives that, we're not aware of yet.
Right.
I mean, this whole thing with these peace talks, it's really gained momentum.
It does feel like things are shifting a bit.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So just to kind of recap the current situation of the war.
Sure.
I mean, obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict is still ongoing.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, but it seems like there is this growing push for these peace talks.
Yeah. I mean, even Trump suggested a meeting with Putin in Saudi Arabia.
Right, and then the UAE is being considered as like a potential place as well.
Exactly.
And that's where Zelensky's visit is interesting.
It is.
Because the article mentions that the UAE has been involved in these prisoner exchanges already.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Between Kyiv and Moscow.
Yeah, and you have to think about all the Russians and Ukrainians who've gone to the UAE since the war began.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of become like this neutral ground.
Right.
Maybe that's why they see it as a good meeting place for both sides.
Yeah, so it's interesting how the UAE is like positioning themselves in this whole thing.
Yeah.
So do we think Zelensky is choosing the UAE for this visit because of their seemingly neutral stance?
That's a good question.
Given his wife was already there.
Yeah. I mean, it could be a strategic move.
Right.
Maybe he sees them as a potential mediator.
Right.
Don't forget he's coming straight from the Munich Security Conference.
Right.
Which is like this big annual meeting where world leaders talk about global security challenges.
Yeah.
So the timing of this, it seems very deliberate.
Yeah. And on top of that, the UAE is hosting the International Defense Exhibition and Conference.
Oh, wow.
Which is a major arms fair.
Uh-huh.
And both Ukraine and Russia are there.
Really?
Yeah. Showcasing their weaponry.
That's wild.
So he goes to a global security conference that's focused on peace, and then lands in a country that's hosting an arms fair where both sides of the conflict are present.
It's almost ironic.
It really is.
Yeah.
Like all these competing interests.
That's a lot.
But let's get back to Zelensky.
Okay.
What's he hoping to achieve on this visit to the UAE?
Well, according to the article, he's got three main priorities: getting Ukrainian captives released, attracting investments and economic partnerships, and getting humanitarian aid.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Those are all really important things for Ukraine right now.
Definitely.
But what about the UAE? What are their motivations for getting involved in these peace talks?
Well, I don't think it's just about being altruistic.
Yeah.
I mean, they've always had strong ties with Russia.
Right, even with all the sanctions.
Exactly. And the article even talked about all the Russian money flowing into Dubai's real estate market.
And all those flights between the Emirates and Moscow.
It's like they're walking this tightrope.
Yeah, trying to keep everyone happy.
Exactly. I mean, even the U.S. Treasury under Biden was
Yeah.
worried about all that Russian cash going into the UAE.
Wow, so they've got a lot to think about. It's interesting, too, because right before Zelensky got there,
Yeah.
the UAE leader met with Russia's first deputy prime minister to talk about, like, strengthening ties.
It just adds another layer to this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if they're trying to position themselves as, the mediator in all this.
Well, that's the question. Can they really be a peace broker with all these,
Yeah.
conflicting relationships?
It's a risky game, for sure.
Yeah, so let's talk about the U.S. for a second.
Okay.
The article mentions that Trump called Putin
Oh, right.
and that there's a U.S. delegation planning to go to Saudi Arabia
Okay.
to talk about Russian officials.
Interesting.
This seems different from how Biden's been handling things, right?
It is a pretty big change from the whole isolating Moscow thing.
Right. And get this, Senator Rubio's leading the delegation
Wow.
to Saudi Arabia.
So we've got Trump wanting to meet with Putin,
Yeah.
a U.S. delegation going to Saudi Arabia,
Right.
and Zelensky going to the UAE.
It's like everybody wants to be involved in these talks.
It seems that way, but what does all this actually mean for the war?
Right. Like, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, and for global geopolitics, too.
It's hard to say because things are changing so fast.
It really is a complicated situation.
So let's say these peace talks actually happen.
Okay.
What are the potential benefits and risks?
Well, I mean, the biggest benefit would be an end to the fighting, right?
Obviously.
Yeah, less violence, less suffering.
And even a ceasefire would be a good start.
Absolutely. And for Zelensky, it could mean getting those captives back.
Right.
And maybe even some concessions from Russia.
Okay, but what about the risks?
Well, one thing to worry about is that Russia might just use the talks to stall.
Oh, you mean so they can regroup?
Exactly. We've seen that happen before in other conflicts.
And knowing Russia, that is a concern.
Definitely.
What else?
Well, any peace deal might require Ukraine to give up a lot.
Like what?
Maybe land or some of their sovereignty.
That's a tough position for Zelensky.
It is. I mean, he wants peace, but he also has to protect Ukraine's interests.
Exactly. And even if they reach an agreement, how do we know it'll last?
Right. Will Russia actually stick to it?
It happened before where these peace deals just fall apart.
And then we're back to square one.
It's hard to know what'll happen. There are so many factors.
Definitely.
But one thing's for sure, these peace talks are a huge deal.
Absolutely.
This could change everything.
Not just for the region, but for the whole world.
And it brings us back to the UAE.
Right.
Are they really neutral, or do they have their own agenda?
It's tough to say. I mean, they've got these good relationships with both Russia and the West.
Yeah, and they've been involved in those prisoner exchanges.
So that gives them some credibility.
Right, but they also have those close economic ties with Russia.
Exactly, especially with finance and energy.
And don't forget, the U.S. Treasury was worried about all that Russian money.
It's a balancing act for them.
Yeah, they're trying to play both sides.
Exactly, trying to protect their own interest while this war is going on.
It will be interesting to see what happens.
Only time will tell what their role will be in all this.
It's like a giant game of chess.
With really high stakes.
So many possibilities.
It just shows how connected the world is.
Yeah, what happens in one place affects everyone.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so important to stay informed.
I completely agree. We can't just sit back and watch.
We all need to understand what's going on in the world.
Yeah, and be part of the conversation.
Yeah, it really is important to stay informed.
It is. It's like we have a responsibility to understand these global issues.
Absolutely. And speaking of global issues,
Yeah.
we haven't really touched on the whole energy situation.
Oh, right, the whole oil and gas thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of this conflict.
Huge. I mean, Russia's a major energy exporter, and Europe relies on them so much.
Yeah, that's given them a lot of leverage.
Definitely.
So how do you think that will play out in these peace talks?
That's a good question. I mean, will countries be willing to compromise on energy security to get a deal?
Or could it be like a deal breaker?
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, another layer of complexity.
Isn't it fascinating, though?
It is. I mean, there's always something new to consider.
Exactly. And that's what we're all about here on The Global Take.
Right, trying to give everyone the information they need to understand this crazy world.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into these potential peace talks.
It has, and it'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this story.
Absolutely. A lot of twists and turns still to come, I'm sure.
For sure. So to all our listeners out there, stay tuned to The Global Take for more analysis and updates on this developing story.
We'll be here to break it all down for you.
And if you want to hear more deep dives like this one, make sure you subscribe to our podcast.
We've got a lot more to talk about.
That's right. We'll be back soon with another episode. So until then, stay curious and stay informed.